Now, not only can the New Testament be traced back to eyewitnesses, but the second E stands for early accounts. Early accounts. In other words, that this was written down very soon after the events themselves. Because what I was taught in college was something very different. I don't know what you studied in college if you took a course on the historical Jesus as I did, but I was taught that, after Jesus died, the people who followed him sort of carried on an oral tradition for a long period of time. And during this long period of time, before it was actually written down, legend grew up and mythology grew up. And it so distorted and tainted the record that we can't trust what the Bible tells us when it talks about Jesus. Have you ever been told that? I mean, that's what I was taught. But that's not what the facts support. Let me sort of create a little, visual here on the stage. Pretend that this podium represents the year 33 AD, which is the year most likely that Jesus was executed. Now, a recent NBC documentary, it was on just recently, a few weeks ago, said that it was about 80 AD, that's 33 AD, this is 80 AD, when Matthew and Luke were written. And a lot of liberal scholars agree with that. Although they would all agree as well that Mark was probably written in, say, 70 AD. So we have this time gap here. And what some theologians like to say is, well, it was during this time that legend grew up and turned a mere man, a mere mortal like Jesus, into the Son of God. That the idea that he was the Son of God did not come up till much later. Now, first I want to say, this is not such a long distance in terms of ancient times. I mean, the earliest biographies we have of Alexander the Great, written by Arrian and Plutarch, are written 400 years after he lived, and they're generally considered to be reliable. Legend did develop, but it was generally in the time after that. And by the way, there were eyewitnesses who were alive in 80 AD who would have served as a corrective if what was being written down was wildly not true. In fact, one of the greatest classical historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford University, did a study at the rate at which legend grew up in the ancient world. And he determined that in the first century ancient world, that the passage of 2 generations of time was not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. So even if this documentary and these scholars are right, that Matthew and Luke and Mark were written about 70 and 80 AD, still, they can be considered trustworthy. But we can bring the events much closer to the life of Jesus. For instance, the Bible contains a book called the Book of Acts. It was written by Luke, this historian that I mentioned. This tells the story of the early church. Now, this is very interesting because at the end of the book of Acts, one of the main characters, the Apostle Paul, is put under house arrest. But you get to the end of the book and you don't know what happens to him. Why? Because the book was probably written before Paul was put to death. In fact, a whole bunch of things happened between 61 and 70 AD that would have been in Acts had Acts been written after they occurred. For instance, 3 of the principal characters in the early church, Paul, Peter, and James, were all put to death between 61 and 64 AD. In the mid-60s AD, Nero persecuted the church. It was a big thing. That certainly would have been in Acts if it had happened before Acts was written. And also, the Jewish-Roman War broke out in 66 AD. That would have been in Acts if Acts had been written after those things took place. So you see what I'm saying? These things would have been recorded in Acts if Acts had been actually written after they occurred. And yet they're not in there. Therefore, we could probably date the writing of the book of Acts to about 60 AD. But we can even go further than that, earlier than that, because even though the book of Acts affirms that Jesus is a miracle-working, resurrected Son of God, we can go even closer to the event because Acts is the second part of a 2-part work. The first part is the biography of Jesus by Luke called the Gospel of Luke. It also affirms that Jesus is a miracle-working, resurrected Son of God. And so it must have come before Acts if Acts was written in 60 AD. So we can take it a step closer. Now, we also know that Luke used some of the writings of Mark in his writings as one of his references. So Mark, which also affirms that Jesus is a miracle-working, resurrected Son of God, must come even before Luke was written because he used it as a source. So now we go earlier still. We also know that the Apostle Paul wrote most of his letters before Mark wrote his gospel. These letters affirm that Jesus is the resurrected, miracle-working Son of God. And so now we can go even further, even closer to the life of Jesus. But Paul, in his writings, included these creeds and hymns of the earliest church that affirm the deity of Jesus. Philippians chapter 2, it says in one of these early creeds of the church that Jesus was in the very nature God. In Colossians chapter 1, another creed is recorded where it says Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Another one is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and following, that contains the essence of Christianity, that Jesus died. Why? For our sins, that he was buried, that he was resurrected on the third day, and then it mentions specific eyewitnesses whose lives were transformed by encountering the resurrected Jesus. This creed has been dated back by scholars from a wide range of theological belief to as early as 24 to 36 months after the life of Jesus, and the beliefs that make up that creed go right back to the cross itself. Friends, we don't have some huge expanse of time during which a mortal Jesus was mythologized into being the Son of God. Right back at the beginning, we have historical records that confirm in the most exalted terms that Jesus Christ is divine. Remember what I said about A. and Sherwin White? The passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. We don't have the passage of 2 generations of time. We have a news flash from ancient history. So, the New Testament trusted because it contains extraordinarily early accounts that weren't, destroyed by legendary development. And they're rooted in eyewitness testimony.